bunch of Twitter accounts, YouTube accounts, and Facebook accounts. Hello, everybody. This is Corey DeAngelis at the Educational Freedom Institute with my co-host, Matthew Nielsen, who's the founder of the Educational Freedom Institute. We're joined today with two very special guests who wrote a fantastic book together. They've co-authored this book that I have on my desk right now. It's called Unshackled, Freeing America's K-12 Education System. And if you look at the back of the book, this guy, Corey DeAngelis, is on the back because I provided a very positive review of the book because it's such a great book. I'll put the link, the Amazon link, in the comments for everybody to go check it out. But our special guests are, first we have Kate Hardiman. She is a JD candidate at Georgetown Law School. And then we have Clint Bolick, who's an associate justice at the Arizona Supreme Court. So thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Corey.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for the blurb, Corey, and really appreciate being on. Sorry you can't see me.
Yeah, and so we had some technical difficulties for everybody wondering why there's just a random square in the corner. That's Clint Bolick, but he's still there.
A random square.
He's still there, and he can respond to questions and stuff. And but yeah, let's just start out really with the first question that we pretty much ask all of our guests. Could you guys give us just a quick, I already introduced you as far as your formal titles go, but just a quick background of how you got interested in education policy, and then maybe move into what really motivated you to write this book in particular.
Well, I guess I'll go first, and mine's a lot longer than Kate's, since she's only like about a tenth my age. But I had planned to be a school teacher, and in fact, I still have lifetime teacher certification in my home state of New Jersey. But student teaching really opened my eyes to how horrific the situation is for so many of our kids in our country. And this is decades ago now. So obviously it's only gotten worse for millions of school children since then. And I decided, instead of becoming a teacher and trying to deal with the problem one student at a time, that I would go into law. And during college, I studied Milton Friedman and learned about the idea of school vouchers, and thought to myself, when I become a lawyer, I want to go out and defend voucher programs. Trouble was, there were no voucher programs. And so it was a while before I had that opportunity, and I ended up co-founding the Institute for Justice. My colleagues and I litigated dozens of school choice cases around the country. And I really fell in love with the idea of school choice, and have always been passionately committed to educational opportunities, particularly for low-income kids. More recently, I joined the Arizona Supreme Court almost exactly 5 years ago, and I've seen it from a very different perspective. Almost every major criminal defendant that comes before my court is the product of an education system that never gave them a chance. And so Kate and I got to know each other a few years ago, and as we were talking, we realized that no one had written a soup to nuts book on education reform. That is, what would we do comprehensively in recreating a school system that would meet the needs of the 21st century and take advantage of the incredible tools available to us in the 21st century. And we decided to do just that, and I couldn't have picked a better co-author.
Thanks, Clint. So I, like Clint, also started my career as a teacher. I graduated from the University of Notre Dame and pursued a 2-year master's program also through Notre Dame called the Alliance for Catholic Education. And through that program, I taught for 2 years at a inner city Catholic school in Chicago, and taught all 4 grades by the time I left. So 9 through 12, English and religion, and absolutely loved it. And that I had interest in school choice before teaching because I had written my senior thesis at Notre Dame on it, but really just seeing the fact that, you know, the students at my school were utilizing choice was remarkable. And I would just get these horror stares from them when I would ask them, you know, what would your life be like if you went to a school in your neighborhood? And they would just look at me and shake their heads. And it just really left an impact on me. And I loved my time teaching. After teaching, I decided to go to law school, which had kind of always been the plan, and ended up at Georgetown. And I decided to do the evening program at Georgetown. So I go to law school at night, and during the day, I work for a constitutional litigation firm. And I've gotten to do a little bit of ed work, but more broadly, some religious and other constitutional issues. So that's been a really great experience. And Clint has just been an invaluable mentor. I really hope long-term to follow in his footsteps, not necessarily into the judiciary, but hopefully as a litigator for educational choice and educational change.
So how did you guys connect? How did you meet each other?
Well, I can tell that story because it's kind of interesting. But Clint gave a talk when I was a senior at Notre Dame. And the way I remember it, at least, I walked up to him after the talk and gave him my senior thesis. And that led to a coffee meeting. And we kept in touch since then. But I don't know if Clint has a different version of events.
No, that's pretty much it. I think you had reached out before the talk because you were writing in part about either Milwaukee or Cleveland, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And so we ended up getting together after my talk and staying in touch after then.
That's great.
Excellent. So let's jump right into it. Give us the lowdown on the book. What's just real quick, 1 or 2 sentences. What got you motivated in it, and then what are your what's the overall thrust of the book and the overall findings of the book?
Well, basically, it begins with the question: what would a K-12 education system look like today if we were designing it from scratch with absolutely no preconceptions, but with all of the amazing technological tools we have at our disposal? And the answer, to keep it to two sentences, is it wouldn't look anything like our current system.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So, what would you add to that, Kate? What would you add to the answer for Corey's question?
Yeah, so I think what we tried to do in the book was look toward, systems that are doing it really well. In the last kind of takeaway chapter, we look at Florida and we say, what is Florida doing really well? But we try to pull together all of the school choice programs out there and really break it down, not necessarily for a policy wonk, but for a parent. And we want, the everyday parent to be able to understand, why is my kid's system the way it is? What are, how could it be different? And hopefully try to motivate some grassroots, desire for change through that.
And one thing to add, it is not primarily a school choice book. One of my motivations for writing it is after all of my years of defending school choice programs and helping make the world safe for school choice, I realized that I had really not made much of a contribution in terms of reforming the system that most of the kids are a part of and will continue to be a part of for the foreseeable future. So certainly many of the things that we've seen in school choice are transferable, especially charter schools, to mainstream public schools. But even with most voucher programs, for example, most kids are still in 30 kid classrooms in rows, just like they were at the end of the 19th century. So we really went at this from a bottom up perspective and asked ourselves, what are the obstacles that need to be removed, unshackled, so to speak, in order for mainstream public schools to become dynamic institutions, student-focused institutions, nimble institutions, and that pretty much forms the focus of the book.
Yeah, I really like how you guys started out with that thought experiment. Could you go into a little more details on that? How would the education system look? What are some parts of the education system that you guys think are particularly just don't make any sense from that standpoint? Are there any things that you see with the traditional public schools, for example, that are either shackling them down or just not allowing for innovation?
Well, I think the biggest thing that stuck out to me, and Clint was really instrumental in driving this part of the book, but the idea of, what to do with the traditional district school, because, even though there's been kind of a mass exodus during COVID, as much as we've seen, in recent years into private schools and homeschools, the fact remains that most kids are still in these district schools. And COVID really put it on, display that these things are just not flexible, and they can't meet the needs of their constituents. And it's just been a real challenge with the virtual learning. So I think the biggest insight to me through all of this was that we can actually, attempt to reform the public district school system by making it more of a community school model, which basically resembles a charter school in the sense of, there's individual school control at each school rather than, these aggregate districts where there's a superintendent and there's all these layers of bureaucracy. And I know, Corey, you've done, a good bit of writing about the bureaucracy in the public school system and, the kind of intermediary of the unions and all of these things that kind of impede individual principal and school decisions for constituents. So I think that's really what was so huge to me, especially after the COVID crisis.
So you said, go ahead, Clint.
Oh, I was going to add, the United States has more bureaucracy in its education system than Russia. Russia prides itself in its bureaucracy, right? And we have so many levels of bureaucracy, all of it siphoning off funding and all of it adding bureaucracy and prescription. And the revolution of the last 40 years in technology has been all about eliminating the middleman, allowing consumers to interact directly with people who provide services and goods. And that has hardly happened in the educational sector. And eliminating school districts would save 50 cents out of every education dollar and remove a tremendous amount of bureaucracy and allow the people who have the greatest stake in the success of the system to have far greater power over how those resources are spent.
Yes. Before you jump in, Matthew, that just reminded me of Ben Scafferty at Kennesaw State University. I think he calls it the 13-layer cake. There's 13 layers of bureaucracy in his state, in Georgia, for example, between when just trying to run a traditional public school. So I can see, that like all of the regulations that are entrenched in the system. Matthew, do you have a specific question?
Yeah, well, Kate, you said something interesting. You used a word in particular as you were explaining, as you were giving that answer. You said that the public school system, traditional public school system, can't meet the needs of all of their constituents. You used the word can't. And I think that actually is true. I think that's the right word to use. And I think that's actually maybe a call for some understanding and for some forgiving to the traditional public school system, because they truly can't meet the needs. If they won't, that's a different situation, right? I mean, then we're talking about something different. But look, there are, what I think the latest number that I've seen is 53 million students in K-12 currently, grades K through 12 across the country. That's 53 million different kids. And for one system to be able to meet the needs of all of those kids, I think is unreasonable. So I think it was a good word to use there, and the right one. But I'm wondering, based on your guys' answer, and Clint in particular, your last response there, did you guys look? You used the figure 50%. Is that? Are you ballparking that? Is that pretty close? 50 cents on every dollar.
It's about the right figure here in Arizona. We actually have every year our state auditor looks at those numbers, because we actually passed. We've passed a number of measures that require increased funding to go into the classroom. And part of that is having the auditor look at where the money is being spent. And I know this is going to be a complete shock to you, but it doesn't get there. And so we've been at roughly 50 cents for a very long time. Obviously, it varies from state to state. And we're not always counting apples to apples, but I think that's roughly the right number.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's big. That's why it's interesting. So
I wanted to ask about specific reforms that you guys think are especially pertinent going forward, just based on your synopsis and everything you've been looking at.
One thing I would just follow up my last comment with is that I actually think the hardest reform that we are proposing is the community school model for the district schools. I mean, I think there are the most impediments to making that a reality, and there are fewer impediments, though still some, to making, more choice programs available, for example. So, I mean, we already see that choice is becoming more attractive after COVID. I think it was Georgia Governor Kemp today said that he was going to start reimbursing families, who have expended dollars to educate their kids during the pandemic. So I think there's more political capital for different types of school choice programs. It's less, legally problematic now that there's, that Espinoza case was decided at the Supreme Court. Not that it was even legally problematic before that.
Yeah, give us the lowdown. Hey, give us the lowdown. A lot of people say school choice is unconstitutional. You're using public dollars at private religious schools. That's a separation of church and state issue. You're violating the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution. What are your responses to that?
Clint, do you want to take that first?
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court resolved that issue by the resounding vote of 5-4. So it's certainly never safe. If I had to guess, and I'm knocking wood when I say this, I assume that we perhaps have a vote to spare on the U.S. Supreme Court at the moment. The greater impediment legally in recent years has been state constitutional provisions, but the U.S. Supreme Court recently held that those provisions which forbid aid to sectarian schools cannot be used to discriminate against religious schools. So at the moment, the legal terrain, plus, add to that the decision, the recent decision holding that that teachers cannot be forced to provide dues to unions. Those things really, the legal terrain right at the moment is better for school choice and mechanisms like school choice than ever before.
Are you looking up the DeAngelis case?
Well, yeah. How do you know when I'm looking up stuff all the time? I'm sending into he's got me figured out. I'm posting the Espinoza case in the comments for our listeners. It's the latest case on school choice, 2020 5-4 decision in favor of school choice this year. So yeah, thanks for addressing that, Clint. Kate, do you have anything to add on Espinoza specific or any additional comments besides what Clint already added?
I think Clint basically covered it. The only thing I would add is that there is a case pending right now in the Tennessee Supreme Court that has to do with their ESA program. And the Court of Appeals actually struck it down as unconstitutional under the state constitution. So it could be that there's another, push to the Supreme Court, because if I believe it's IJ handling that case. And if they lose in the Tennessee Supreme Court, it is likely that they will seek cert in the U.S. Supreme Court.
And that Tennessee case, for listeners, just to be clear, has to do something with their state constitution called the Home Rule. And they're arguing that the state is forcing particular localities to use this program. And so they're saying, since it's not a statewide program, it's unconstitutional. But the same people saying that would never argue for a statewide program. They're just trying to use this as a way to get rid of the program. And it doesn't have much of anything to do with this religious schools aspect, from what I can tell. Going forward, in the book, I saw you guys cited some evidence about school choice. Or were there any particular studies that jumped out to you guys, glossing over the evidence that you found to be especially compelling?
That's Corey fishing for a compliment. Well, there was this one study that this one guy did.
I think Corey is the most cited source in our book.
I'm joking. He would.
Something I actually don't think Corey did this piece of information, but I remember Clint relied heavily in one of the chapters that he ran point on about what our system would look like if we didn't have so much administrative bloat, and the billions of dollars more or millions of dollars more, the figures escape me, that we could be paying teachers if we didn't have so much district bureaucracy. So just going back to that original point about eliminating the middleman of the district bureaucracy, thinking about how we would reallocate those dollars if we had the cost savings there.
And for listeners, I think that's back to the staffing surge by Ben Scafferty I'm putting into the comments. But I think he did do those estimations for each individual state in that report. So I recommend everybody to go check out that link. It's at edchoice.org. It's a think tank that used to be called the Friedman Foundation for School Choice. And Ben Scafferty's he's actually an advisory board member at the Educational Freedom Institute. So everybody go check it out.
And Corey, just to return to an earlier point that relates to what you were just saying, Kate had mentioned before that moving to community schools, which are essentially charter schools, but run as by the government, with school-based boards. She mentioned that she thought that might be the toughest reform. And she may be right, but the other side of that is that if this money is freed up from bureaucracy, there will be tremendous additional money available for salaries. We will be able to pay teachers like the professionals we hope they are. And that's going to be attractive to a lot of teachers, possibly even to teacher unions in some instances. There's no love lost in a lot of the large school districts between the districts and the unions. And this is certainly one of those issues where there could be a divergence of interest. Now, along with that, however, it is absolutely essential that we pay teachers for performance. Simply giving every teacher in the system another $20,000 means that we're giving a $20,000 raise to the very, very best teacher and to the very, very worst teacher. So we have got to give these community schools the ability to hire and fire, and to provide, whether it's performance incentives or differential pay based on expertise, But certainly, and this was one of the elements, Kate mentioned Florida before, this is one of the elements driving the Florida success, is giving teachers financial rewards for tangible accomplishments. For example, the number of minority kids passing AP exams. As soon as that happened, guess what happened? The number of minority kids passing AP tests soared. And there's really no magic to this. It's taking the principles that apply so well in every other aspect of our economy and applying it to the most important service that our economy should provide.
It's the Peter Drucker quote, right? What you measure gets managed, or what gets measured gets managed.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a few people that gets attributed to it in different ways, I think. But I wanted to ask, I think the listeners might be confused a little bit about community schools and the exact definition of this. You guys mentioned that they're kind of like charter schools. So let me know if I get this right. Are they? Well, actually, I don't know. Are they privately managed or run or run by the government? Is my main question. And then secondly, from what I can tell, they wouldn't be residentially assigned. You would be able to choose them. And then I guess the difference from charters would be that, from what I'm hearing from you guys, is that you'd have a school board as well. So
we didn't get too granular in our definition because we think that there could be a whole variety of types of community schools. But the main thing is that every state constitution requires the state to provide a system of education. And this would be that. And the way that it would be performed is that the state would be responsible for funding education. And we haven't even really talked about education savings accounts yet, but we think that it's very important for the funding to enter the school through the students rather than directly from the state, other than perhaps capital expenditures and that sort of thing. And the state would set minimum standards for education and would also monitor education performance. But the schools themselves would be run by boards, which would be public institutions. And those boards would have, within the infrastructure of the state, would have complete authority over hiring, firing, spending, educational mission, etc. So they would very much resemble charter schools, but they would be state schools.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense.
That's good. And just so you know, that people are commenting here and there. I just want to we didn't say this at the beginning, but people are commenting here and there and asking questions. So maybe at the end, we'll throw up a couple of questions for you guys and you can try to answer them.
Sounds good.
The only other thing I would add to Clint's community schools description, which was very good, is this idea that I've been seeing more and more about how really the issue with unions is potentially that they are like, the district schools themselves, part of a giant bureaucracy. And we have these unions at the national level, but really it might be more helpful to have, unions of teachers who want to join them at the school level. And I know Rebecca Friedrichs has been instrumental in trying to pioneer, actual teacher-led unions, not like unions as special interests operating at a national political level, but perhaps, unions led by teachers at the school level is definitely less problematic.
Yeah, so Clint mentioned ESAs. Could you guys go into a little bit about ESAs for the listeners and background on those and what you guys think about these types of programs and any other commentary on that? And then once you move from there, I have another follow-up question about what's your biggest pushback on the book? What have opponents of your book come to say about it or say about you guys or your ideas at least? So that's two questions, quick on ESAs, and then hopefully if we can get to pushback after that.
Well, first, a word about the history of ESAs, education savings accounts. They were started here in Arizona, and they were a creature of necessity. School vouchers had been struck down, and so the school choice proponents struggled to come up with a different form of school choice. And the problem that the Arizona Supreme Court had with vouchers was that they could only go to one destination, and that was private schools. And we thought to ourselves, what if we had funding that went to the families that they could use in a whole variety of educational contexts, not just private school tuition, though it could be used for that, but also educational therapy, tutoring, distance learning, purchasing discrete services from public schools, and on and on. And when we thought about that, we're like, why haven't we been doing this all along? This is exactly what a 21st century education funding system would look like, because it individualizes education for each and every family. So that's basically what ESAs are. A number of states have passed them. A number of states have had serious obstacles to them, but we really love this system because it does make the consumer sovereign, and it forces providers, not just public sector providers, but private sector providers as well, to offer high quality products at a low price that are highly personalized. And we have the technology to do that. So this would simply enable families to purchase whatever educational services they wanted. And by the way, one of the things, since the book has come, even though this book is brand new, it was written before pods, the newest phenomenon.
Yeah, what's that? What's a pod?
Right, exactly. And so that word does not appear in our book, I'm sorry to say, but ESAs would support that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So just following up on Corey's question, I think, a pod is if a group of students want to band together and essentially form their own mini school, and they could potentially hire a teacher or use virtual learning or some combination of the two. And I mean, imagine if we had ESAs in place before that. There was this huge outcry that pods were not equitable because, only rich students could use them. But the idea of an ESA is that, it would be either means tested, which would mean that, the lower income students could use it first, or available to all, which would mean that there would be no issue of equity. So it was kind of staggering during the whole pod debate to think about
the latest in school segregation. I think the New York Times called it in the headline.
Yeah, and it could have been so different if ESAs had already become mainstream.
So Clint, you have you're based in Arizona, right?
Yes.
There's Prenda micro schools out there. Have you
Yes.
Been able to have any experience with any families that have been using those kind of schools, or do you have any background of information on Prenda micro schools or other types of micro schools?
Not as yet, but it's funny you asked that because one of my dearest friends started work there on Monday. So I hope to remedy that situation, that lack of direct contact in the very, very near future.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we had Kelly Smith on the Educational Freedom Institute podcast before. He's the CEO and founder of Prenda Micro Schools, and we know some people in our circles that are actually family members that have used ESAs to access the micro schools out there in Arizona. So it's a really interesting case study state to look at for looking at these kinds of reforms. So yeah, let's get to the pushback angle. Have you guys experienced pushback from the other side, either as you were writing this book or after it came out? Have there been any arguments levied against you guys, or at least your ideas that you've had to either respond to or that you'd like to respond to here on the podcast?
So I think one thing we were pretty intentional about when we were writing the book was to anticipate the main arguments that we would get against choice. And so that section comes in one of the later chapters where we basically just lay out, okay, school choice does not cherry pick students. Here are the 5 main criticisms that people will levy against us. And I think Clint and I had just collected those after our, years of advocating for these ideas. But I mean, I at least haven't encountered any major pushback to date, but I feel like, there will be union people who will be against it. There will be people who think that, school choice siphons money from the public school system who are against it. But
yeah, what's your response to that? School choice steals money and funnels money away from the public schools, and that's going to hurt students. What do you guys have to say to that? That is the main argument that's made against school choice.
You can keep going, Kate.
Okay. So, I mean, the main reason that is incorrect is that really what school choice does is leads to a more efficient allocation of resources. And moreover, public schools are already hurting students if the students are not succeeding there. And we have ample evidence that that is the case. So we should be less concerned about taking money away from buildings and more concerned about funding students. And funding students will allow the students to go into schools or homeschools or alternative arrangements where they're more successful. And that should be our end goal, not that we have a certain pot of money in each building.
I like it. Go ahead, Clint.
The book is only 2 weeks old, or actually a little less than 2 weeks old. So again, I'm knocking on wood. We haven't encountered a lot of pushback, but I was mentioning to Kate recently that there was a recent Atlantic article that you guys probably read, and it turned out to be a bit much ado about nothing. But basically, the theme was we should use this time to really think about how to reformulate our school system. I'm like, oh my gosh, these people sound like us. And basically, the bottom line recommendation was holding more classes outdoors. I was so underwhelmed. But the number of reader comments that savaged that article were breathtaking. And I'm realizing there are a lot of people who may not like our book who have a lot of spare time on their hands right at the moment. So I suspect that the criticism will eventually come.
Well, that's good and good for now, right? Because, like you say, that could change, but and it probably will. But hey, that if people are paying attention and reading, then that's not a bad thing. So
your book just came out, and this past year has been pretty crazy with the pandemic raging, and a lot of the public schools have been kicking and screaming against reopening in person for so many families. Is there kind of an intersection between things that you wrote about in the book and what's going on right now in the public school system?
Absolutely. I mean, especially the inflexibility that just highlights, every argument we make about the middleman and how schools are not able to adapt quickly in the face of changing circumstances. And that's not to say that there haven't been some innovative responses. I mean, South Carolina was really interesting in that they, put Wi-Fi on public school buses and repurposed them and sent them into, low-income areas. And that's brilliant. But it's so much harder for that to happen when there are 13 layers of bureaucracy to go through.
Well, and Kate is absolutely right about that. There have actually been some school districts that have said, we don't know anything about virtual learning, and hired online education organizations that have been doing it for decades and are providing a high quality education for all of their kids. That it just the last year or so underscores how we have to introduce flexibility into the system and allow greater transportability of resources.
And what's interesting, I like that you guys point out a major part of your book to allow the public schools to have more flexibility because a lot of the people in the debate will say, you know, those people calling for school choice are just anti-public schools. They want to destroy the public schools. But what you guys are pointing out that, you know, one, this could be great for teachers, but it could also, you know, we also want to have a more level playing field by allowing the public schools to have that flexibility too in that competitive environment to actually, have the same kind of flexibility that private and charter type of schools have.
Yeah, and we've seen that on even here in Arizona on a pretty significant scale, just with interdistrict choice. Any child in the entire state of Arizona can go to any public school in the state of Arizona. And no sooner did that happen than some school districts began providing very tailored offerings, including schools for the arts. And of course, competition from charter schools helped in this regard as well. And gifted programs and all sorts of other programs, and other school districts did not. And the financial consequences have followed. So the more of that we can foster, the stronger the public schools are going to become.
Can you tell us more about, because it's certainly not the most common response or reaction to school choice advocacy, because we've already said, and that's true, the most common argument against school choice is the funding. So yes, that's number one, but probably in the top 5 is that you just want to destroy public schools. Like you said, Corey, that I hear that, I see that, I read that constantly. It's out there. We don't know why. I've never been given a reason as to why anyone would want to do that per se. But I'm curious. We have 2 people here. We have 2 co-authors here for this book. Tell us what your response is to that accusation or to that criticism.
Well, for me, I have a pretty personal response, and that is that that I've raised 4 kids, and not a single one of them has spent a single day in a private school. I am personally committed to, nor I. I never spent a day before college in a private school. And you know, why would I want to destroy the system that my kids are going to? So I've got a personal stake. In fact, when I used to debate school vouchers a lot, I would often begin, even without knowing anything about my debate opponent, asking publicly, where do you send your kids to school? I'll tell you where I send my kids to school. And it was just incredible. The overwhelming majority of them sent at least one kid to private schools. As a lawyer, you're never supposed to ask a question you don't know the answer to, but boy, was that a safe one.
I believe that.
But beyond that, you know, this is America's survival is at stake here. We are up against China, which is the greatest menace, you know, in the history of the world. They are cleaning our clocks educationally, and we cannot afford for that to happen. When we're looking up at at Balkan nations in terms of educational performance, we've got to really get going. And if people want to hurl accusations, I think over the last year, a lot of those accusations have begun to ring hollow when more and more people are seeing that the emperor has no clothes. We need systemic reform, and we need it immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Clint said. And I also went to public high school. I went to Catholic, college and now law school, but I'm a product of the public system as well. And it worked for me. I don't think it works for every kid. The kids who I taught in Chicago, their neighborhood public school would not have worked for them. And they were fortunate enough to leave it. So the idea is not about dismantling public school writ large. It's about getting kids into the schools or arrangements that work for them.
I mean, just imagine if someone said that allowing families to choose their grocery store was anti-Safeway. It just
Yes.
wouldn't make sense. Like, people would never make that accusation. It's like, what? You may even shop at Safeway and still like the freedom to be able to choose something else. So you're obviously not anti. I mean, it just doesn't. It's similarly like saying that, allowing people to shop at or choose their grocery store defunds Walmart. Why would it defund Walmart? The money doesn't belong to Walmart. Similarly, the education dollars don't belong to buildings. Like, to bring up what Kate brought up earlier, I think that's the best response, right? To reallocate the dollars from buildings and systems to students. And I think that's the best response to these types of accusations from the other side.
But be serious, Corey. I mean, you can't be comparing, honestly, you can't be comparing a grocery store to education. I mean, these are people. These are kids.
Yeah, so let's do a higher education and pre-K as well, because we fund Pell Grants and GI Bills and pre-K programs where the money follows the child. So, what else do you guys want to? I mean, we've talked a lot about the book and how it relates to the current situation. Just for everybody, one more time. This is it'll be more than one more time, but Unshackled, Freeing America's K-12 Education System. I'm going to share that in the comments again. Make sure everybody get this. It's a new book. It's super relevant right now, especially with what we're seeing with the public school system just having a really hard time adapting to the individual needs of so many families across the nation right now. It's just a super important book that everybody should check out. But Clint and Kate, what are you guys like final thoughts on where we're at with this right now, and maybe a last closing statement or summary of what you want us to end on and what you want people to remember.
Yeah, would just say that, it was such a fun collaboration to write this with Clint, who has so much more experience than I do in this field. But the main takeaway that I hope is that parents will pick up this book and read it. It's not written for policy people. We want, parents to be able to read it and to be able to understand, and hopefully to be able to lead the next generation of educational change.
And I would mention that one of the school districts we highlight in the book is New Orleans. And one of the worst things that ever happened in New Orleans was Hurricane Katrina. But out of that disaster came unbelievable progress in one of the nation's worst education systems. The last year has been a Katrina moment for the entire country with regard to education. And kids, my own daughter, her school day now, entirely online, is 7:30 to 11:30, 30-minute classes for a 10th grader. And that's just, it's outrageous. We're going to take such a giant step backwards this year. But I'm really hoping that the exact same thing will happen as happened in New Orleans. And that is that we seize the opportunity to say, how can we do things differently and not just at the margins? And I want to return the compliment to Kate. With my day job, I would never have been able to write a book like this all by myself. So very, very grateful, and hope that she quickly becomes the education reform superstar that you guys are. And so please keep up the work. Great work.
Yeah, I want to say thank you guys so much for coming on the podcast and talking about your new book. I want to tell the listeners, thank you guys so much for listening to this conversation. You can find it on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and on pretty much any podcast platform you can think of if you want to check it out later. But make sure you go and check out this book on the screen. I'll also hold it up. Unshackled, Freeing America's K-12 Education System, co-authored by Clint Bolick and Kate Hardiman, two excellent people who are on the podcast today. So go check it out. I also put it into the comments. It's available on Amazon. It's a new book. It's super relevant right now. Again, this is what we're going through with the K-12 education system right now. Families are scrambling. public school systems in so many places are having a really hard time adapting. And that's not because of the intentions of the employees in the system. It's because of the regulations and the way that the system is set up. It's not the people. And there's a lot of ways to fix that, which these co-authors go over in detail in the book. So I recommend it again for everybody to go check it out. But again, thanks, Clint, and thanks, Kate, for coming out and joining us.
Yeah, we
Thank
appreciate
you,
it.
Corey, and thank you, Matthew, for having us. And please do keep up the good work.
Awesome.
All right.
We appreciate it.
Until next time, everybody. That was the Educational Freedom Institute podcast.